Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this episode we're going to look at the Delortto DHLA baseline setting. Now when I say baseline setting, I'm referring to configuring the carburetor in a way that it's going to operate on an engine. And it depends, of course, what the engine is, but we at least will have a basic setting for the jets, for the barrel size, for the yokes, and so on, so that the engine can really run. Once you have the baseline correct, you can start fine-tuning, or you can start actually tuning, as we say. It doesn't make sense to start tuning without a proper baseline. And in this specific video, we're going to look at the yoke and the barrel size. And in case you have forgotten what the barrel is, what the yoke is, and all the different elements on that carburetor, you can always refer to the first video on the Delortto DHLA. However, let's take a little recap on this one so we can actually look on the barrel and we can look on the yoke, because this is what we're going to discuss in this video. So when we talk about the barrel, it is that opening right here. And in this case, this is a 40, as you can see. And the 40 refers back to the stamping on the housing of the carburetor, because this is a DHLA 40. If this was a Weber, it would have said a DCOE 40. Now inside the barrel, we are having what we call a yoke, and this is a yoke. It's a smaller part that actually fits inside the barrel, and it has a very specific purpose. Let us now define the size of the barrel, because that's going to determine how much mass of air can flow through the carburetor. And I'm quite sure you all have heard the term CFM, so cubic feet per minute, or we can also talk about liters per minute. It depends if you're using imperial or metric systems, and this might be a little bit of a mix, but in each case you will see on the screen each time the corresponding metric or the corresponding imperial sizes. So the barrel needs to be calculated. And if the barrel is too big, we have an issue. And if the barrel is too small, we also have an issue. So we need to calculate it properly. And then in the second part of the video, we're going to actually calculate the yoke or the primary venturi, because the yoke or the primary venturi is responsible for airspeed. And we're going to need airspeed to create the venturi effect. And if you don't remember what the venturi effect is, I would recommend you to look at the first video on the Delortto DHLA 40, because there we explain everything in great depth. So, how do we go about now calculating the barrel size of the carburetor? Well, that's going to depend from engine to engine. And in my case, I'm going to use a 2-liter engine, 4-cylinder. And it's a standard engine, nothing really special. And I decided that I will use 2 DHLA carburetors, or 2 Webers, for that purpose. And I'm going to use an intake manifold like this one, which actually has a channel for every cylinder. So I will have 1 barrel for 1 channel or 1 cylinder. So 1 barrel per cylinder. Now in your case, that might be different. You might have 1 carburetor, which is in essence 2 barrels, serving maybe all 4 cylinders. Or you have 1 barrel serving 2 cylinders. So all kind of combinations are possible, but the kind of calculations we're going to do here do apply for all of it. Of course, you need to match that up. If you're going to serve 2 cylinders from 1 barrel, then obviously you're going to need a bit more airflow. That's one thing. The second thing we need to know is, well, what is our target RPM? Because the main venturi, or the yoke as we call it, is really part of the main circuit. Now the main circuit are your emulsion tubes, the main fuel jet, the main air correction jet, and the secondary venturi, and of course the yoke, right? This is your main circuit. So when the throttle is open, you will need to have sufficient mass and you have to have sufficient airspeed. The idle circuit, the progression circuit, and even the acceleration and the cold start are really not affected by the barrel size and the yoke size. It is all about the main circuit. And that is why you need to target a RPM target. I'm going to go for mine at around 6,000 RPM. This is where my power band is. This is where I want to have my car to perform at wide open throttle. So we always look at wide open throttle to determine how much mass of air we need to get in. And that's a pretty simple calculation, and we'll do it in a second on a slide so you can see some numeric examples. There's one more thing you really need to know about your engine, and that is how efficient is the filling of your cylinder. And here we talk about the volumetric efficiency, VE. It sounds like a complicated word, but it's not really all that complicated. If we are running an engine, then we want to fill up the cylinder to the full 100% whenever we have the intake stroke. And when we can fill that up for 100%, then we have a very efficient and powerful engine. If we cannot, then we're going to lose some of that performance and power. Now, a natural aspirated engine, it is almost impossible to fill it for the full 100%. If you have a forced induction engine like a turbo or a blower, then you can blow more air into the cylinder than actually its volume. So you can go above 100%. But we're not talking about this. We're talking about natural aspirated engines. So back to that engine. The cylinder head is having constraints. We have the valves, we have the valve guides, but we have also the channels in the cylinder head. We have our intake manifold with constraints. So there's a lot of restrictions actually on the cylinder head that are going to partially block and affect the airflow into the cylinder. So it's going to have a negative effect on the efficiency, on how well we can fill the cylinder. And normal engines, commercial engines, especially older ones, we're talking about an 85% efficiency. So the VE, the volumetric efficiency, is somewhere around 85%. So we will only be able to fill the cylinder for 85%. A conditioned engine where maybe we have the head float. So you've seen this before on videos where people clean out the channels and they take off the sharp corners inside the cylinder head, especially on the intake manifold, so the air can flow more smoothly. Then often we talk about a 90% volumetric efficiency, and that's already fairly high. And if you really start talking about a tuned race engine, maybe we have even 95% efficiency. Think about the camshaft. Lots of degrees on the camshaft, maybe 320, maybe 340 degrees camshaft with a lot of valve overlap. This is going to work great on very high RPMs, and we will benefit from that basically in filling the cylinder. So really, you need to decide for yourself what is your volumetric efficiency on your engine. And if it's a standard one, I would use 85 to 88. If it's a tuned engine, maybe you can go to 90. And if it's a very heavily tuned, modified engine, then use 90. What we're going to do is we're going to take the volume of a single cylinder, which is basically the surface of the bore, multiplied by the stroke, and that gives you the volume of the cylinder. And then we will then multiply that by the RPMs. Now in my case, I'm having a single barrel for a single cylinder, and we know on a 4-stroke we have 270 degrees on the crankshaft for one full cycle. So we have one intake every 2 full rotations of the cylinder. So we're going to divide the volume multiplied by the RPMs by 2, because then that will give me how much volume that cylinder will need per minute. And then I'm going to multiply it with the VE factor, the volumetric efficiency factor, again, which is going to depend. And I probably will use, in my case, 85 or 0.85, which is, it's a percentage. Right? And that will give you the cubic feet per minute or the cubic meters per minute that your engine is going to need to breathe. So now let's have a look what this means in cubic feet per minute or cubic meters per minute. The engine spec, as we discussed, is a 2-liter engine, 4-cylinder. I will have 1 barrel per cylinder. I'm going to run at 6,000 RPMs at wide open throttle and a V of 85. If I apply the following formula, I can actually calculate the air volume needed per minute. I'll take the volume of the cylinder, multiply it by 6,000 RPM, and then multiply it by the volumetric efficiency divided by 2. That gives me 1,275 liters per minute. And then I convert this to basically cubic meters per minute or cubic meters per second. If I was to do the same calculation now in the imperial size, I would take for my volume cubic inches, which is 30.511 multiplied by 6,000 RPMs and multiplied by the VE divided by 2. That gives me 77,803 cubic inches per minute. And now I can convert this back down to cubic feet, and that would give me 45 cubic feet per minute or 0.75 cubic feet per second. With this information, we can now actually start to calculate the barrel size. Now we know exactly how much air has to flow in terms of volume per second or per minute through the barrel of the carburetor. That allows us to calculate the surface of the barrel. Now, the barrel surface has been calculated based on the flow that we just calculated, divided by a constant. And when I say a constant, I'm referring to a fixed value. And the value that we're going to use is 100 meters per second, or its equivalent in the imperial system. The reason we are using 100 meters per second is that we want to stay subsonic. And we all know that the speed of light is 343 meters per second. We want to stay below that, because if you go above 100 meters per second, we are going to get some problems with the pressure, with the air density. It's going to change. It's going to actually have a lot of changes that we cannot really afford on our carburetor, because it's going to become extremely difficult then to measure the right amount of fuel and so on. Furthermore, our Bernoulli principle will no longer stand, and the Bernoulli principle says in essence that when an airstream passes over a cavity, it's going to increase a depression, a lower pressure. If the airspeed increases, we are going to get a larger depression or even lower pressure. That whole theorem is no longer going to be correct if we are exceeding the subsonic speed, or if we're getting too close even to subsonic speed. So 100 meters per second is more than acceptable to do our calculation. Let us do some number crunching, and we are going to stick to what I just explained about 100 meters per second at wide open throttle. There is a good reason why. It's compressibility limit, but it's also the Bernoulli assumptions that would break down and so on, as you can see on the screen. So if we are going to take the barrel airflow we just calculated and we divide it by our maximum velocity V barrel max, which is the 100 meters per second, then we will end up with the barrel surface. Now I've done it in metric because when you buy in a Weber or a Delortto carburetor, it's going to be in metric, but you can convert it to imperial if you decide so. So we are getting a certain number of 213 square meters that we will then convert actually to square millimeters, which equates to 213. And now we know the surface of the barrel. And if we need to know the diameter of the barrel, right here, then there's a very simple calculation to be done on that. We are going to take the surface, we multiply it by 4, then we divide it by pi, and then we take the square root of that result, and that will give us the exact diameter we should have on our barrel. So let's have a look on how that looks like. So we know now that we have 213 square millimeters. We multiply that by 4 divided by pi, and then we take the square root. And you can see the calculation basically on the screen. It actually boils down to 16.47 millimeters of diameter for our
barrel, and that seems to be extremely low. I can already hear you guys saying, oh, this cannot be right, that's a mistake. Well, keep in mind, this is the theoretical perfect barrel that we should have. But in reality, we don't have such a barrel. There are many things that will affect this, and that is why we typically will multiply this by a factor of 2. And that brings me to the barrel diameter in practice. We do multiply by 2, and this is not a figure I came up with. This is very common practice, and the reason we need to do this is because of the throttle plate which is in the barrel. It has a certain size. We also have the shaft of the throttle plate. We have the wall thickness of the secondary venturi and so on. But we also have a flow margin. And that is why we always multiply by 2. So if we multiply the 16.47 millimeters by 2, that brings us to a 33 millimeter opening for the barrel, which then sits very well into the area of the DHLA 40 for a Delortto or a DCOE 40 for a Weber. So if you put this down in a little table, then you can see what the requirements are and what a specific carburetor can actually fulfill. So the DHLA 40 or the DCOE 40, it is quite alright for any flow below 0.020 cubic meter per second. If you need more, well, then you go to a 45 or you go to a 48, as you can see in the table. I also added the cubic feet per second for those of you that actually do calculations in cubic feet per second, and you can see as well there the result.
So now we know the diameter on our carburetor, but that's not the only thing. We only took care now of the mass, the amount of air that travels through it. But we need something else. We need air speed. We're going to need a certain airspeed through these yokes or the primary venturis. Any airspeed below 20 meters per second is not going to do us any good on the primary circuit. It's going to deliver a very irregular fuel delivery, and we're going to be running very lean. The engine is going to feel very lame. So we need more, between 20 and 25 meters per second in the primary venturi at wide open throttle. We will have a pretty good responsive engine on a standard engine. However, if we are getting into racing conditions, then you need more fuel really, so the venturi will have to start to deliver more fuel. Then we're really looking between 25 meters and 30 meters per second in the primary venturi. And then if you really get into high RPM engines, then we're looking at something between 35 and 40. So these are the air speeds we would expect in the primary venturi. Now I have made a little spreadsheet that does a calculation on an example, and I'm going to show you that and explain it on how that works while we are calculating our primary venturi. So right now we know what our CFM is, we know what our barrel is, we know what our required airspeed is in our prime venturi, so we can do that calculation in a very simple way.
So before we actually go into calculate the yoke, let's look at the continuity principle. On the screen we have a pipe, and the pipe has a surface A1 and a surface A2. Surface A2 could be our yoke, and you notice that A2 is a lot smaller than A1. Also, we have a speed 1 and we have a speed 2. Now the continuity principle says that the surface A1 multiplied by the speed V1 must be equal to the surface of A2 multiplied by V2. If we now look on the little symbols where we have marked volume 1, we can see that we have a large surface A1 and a reasonable low speed V1. However, when the air gets towards surface number 2, we see that the volume is now a bit changed. We have a smaller surface, but to compensate for the volume, as it has to be the same as volume 1, the airspeed V2 is increased. So at the end, both are equal in terms of volume. And this is how we're going to create more air speed. So the smaller the surface becomes at the yoke, the faster the airflow will be. And you already have seen what our target airflows are. So now we are ready to calculate the yoke. We already know the needed airflow because we have that calculated before, and we also know the required air velocity. The formula is very simple. The needed airflow equals the surface A multiplied by the air velocity. We are looking for surface A. If we extract surface A from the formula, then we can divide the cubic meters per second, which is the volume we're going to need, divided by the airspeed. And that delivers us 0.00585 square meters. Now that is the surface of the yoke. And to convert the yoke surface to the yoke diameter, all what we need to do is multiply the surface by 4 divided by pi 3.14, and then that result we are pulling the square root of that, and that delivers us about 29 millimeters of diameter for the yoke. So most likely I would round this up to 30.
So my friends, now you know on how to calculate the barrel size and the yoke size. Obviously the barrel will always have to be bigger than the yoke, but the most critical element is the yoke. So if you want to fit a 45 or even a 48 carburetor on your engine, based on the calculations we've done, you can. There is no issue really with the barrel as such, as long as you fit the proper yoke. But keep in mind that not all yoke sizes are available and that you might have to round it off upwards or downwards. It depends a bit where you want to have your power. Also, some of the yoke sizes don't fit in a 48 and some will fit in a 48. So there's a range of yokes available and therefore you would have to look on the catalog. But in this specific case, a barrel of 40 would be perfect and there's ample of yokes you can actually fit in there. We have a starting yoke, 29 or 30, and from here on we would start using that to further tune the carburetor, and that's going to be for the next videos once we start tuning the carburetor. But there's still a lot more things we need to discuss on this carburetor in terms of jetting, in terms of emulsion tubes, acceleration pump, acceleration jets, and so on. And that's coming in the next video. And now I just want to show you a very simple calculator I created in numbers because I'm a Mac user, but you could do it in Excel, that allows you to very quickly calculate the yoke.
Excel spreadsheet or a number spreadsheet, as I'm a Mac user, to calculate the primary yoke based on all the formulas we've seen. I'm just repeating a little bit the concept of continuity, and you already have seen this in the previous slides. The surface multiplied by the speed of V1 right here has to be the same as the surface multiplied by V2, the speed here. This is what we saw about 3 slides ago. And also I'm looking a little bit about the Bernoulli explanation, how the pressure is dropping whenever the airspeed increases. I have not gone too deep into the entire formula because that would take us a little bit too far, but you can look it up if you want. So on the spreadsheet, I just plugged in the formulas that we have been looking through. So my target RPM for my engine was 6,000 RPMs. I have a half a liter cylinder volume, so 4 cylinders, it's 2 liters or 2000 cc's. I'm targeting a volumetric efficiency of 85 and I have an airflow set to 30, which is ideal for wide open throttle. Now of course you can change those things. I could probably tune this a bit more, maybe and go for an 88% volumetric efficiency, and then you can see how my liters per minute are changing. And here we go, that's the formula for that, and you've seen that. That also then gives me cubic meter per second. There we go. Again, that's the formula for that one. It's the target RPM liters divided by the minutes. And then we can actually see what the yoke is supposed to be. Hidden are a lot of calculations, just the ones that you saw in actually the presentation I just did. And this results in a yoke of about 30 and 56 millimeters. I think the yoke of 30 would be just good enough. So you can make this kind of a spreadsheet yourself. I've given you all the calculations that you can do and the formulas. So I hope that can help a little bit.
So I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I did, and I'll see you in the next one, where we're going to talk more about the sizing and baselining on the carburetor wheel. We're focusing on the emulsion tubes, the main fuel jet, the air correction jet, the idle jets, and all those other elements that are making up the Delortto carburetor.